Hi there, and welcome to Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. My name is Joshua Bissell, and I'm the editor of this weekly podcast where we tackle topics of abuse prevention and vulnerable sector protection. This week, I'm not only our editor, but I'm also the special guest. So let's bring in Melodie and we can get into our conversation today. Hi, Melodie.
Hi, Josh. Welcome so much. We're so glad that you're participating in this. The reason Josh is with us today is because he is an educator. His background is education as a teacher. He now serves as our Chief Operating Officer at Plan to Protect, but his background is in education. We often say at Plan to Protect, no segment of our society is immune to abuse, and that includes schools. I read a recent statistic that stated that over the last 20 years in Canada, 1,272 students were sexually abused within their school. And of that number, 86% were abused by teachers. Josh, tell me, why is abuse so prevalent within schools?
Thank you, Melodie. Yeah, I think we're going to get into an awful lot of different reasons and different vulnerabilities that schools and education have in particular today. My experience is that I went through teachers college. I qualified as a teacher in Canada, and then I moved over to the UK where I've taught both as a supply teacher as well as in a primary school classroom. Abuse is just not talked about nearly enough. Abuse isn't addressed, isn't on front of mind. Safety and protection are not normal parts of everyday conversation for educators. Generally, what happens is in teachers college you get very, very little training about abuse prevention and signs and indicators. I remember when I was in teachers college, we had somebody come in from our certifying body to talk about what it meant to be part of that organization and the accountability that they offered. But functionally, most of my experience in classrooms, in lunchrooms, was more about how we could protect ourselves from that certifying body. The conversations we had were more adversarial, either against administration, against the certifying body or the province, and how we could band together and unify on that side. And conversations that did come up about abuse, which was very, very rare, were more about standing with teachers who have been accused, whether falsely or more accurately.
I can remember your sister, who also became an educator. She took 5 years concurrent education, and she said during that time, only 1 hour was dedicated to any training around child protection. And she said, often students would skip class and not be there. So that means that someone could graduate, become a teacher, and never receive any education. And then I know many family members that are teachers, and they have said that they've received no education from their board of education on child protection. Very few school boards require annual education. It's only been in the last few years. But listen to some of these crazy stories. It's just heartbreaking. Here is a family alleges sexual assault of a 12-year-old boy by a male teacher. A child with special needs is sexually abused by his grade 7 teacher. A male high school teacher assaults a female student. A guidance counselor enters into a sexual relationship with one of the students in the high school. The statistics I read indicated that 75% of the abuse that has happened among schools within the last 20 years happened in high school. And that reminds me of a time I was flying across the country and I was sitting next to a teacher on a school trip. And the plane was filled with students. And one of the students turned around to the teacher and said, "Hey, that was really fun having you come into our hotel room last night. You were flirting with all of us." And that was just a disclosure by one of the male students to a female teacher that had come into his hotel room the night before. So this does happen, and abuse is prevalent in schools. And often the studies that have been found have been discovered as they read through the disciplinary action notes and newspaper articles about abuse that has happened within schools. So, Josh, let's talk about why are schools really prone to abuse. And now I want to say from the very beginning that most teachers are excellent teachers. I have many family members that are teachers, and they're beautiful examples of integrity, hard work, excellence. And I am not for a minute saying that all teachers are abusers. But just like every other segment of society, some locations, like schools, do provide opportunity for people to abuse students. So let's talk about schools. Why don't you start off? You tell us, why are schools vulnerable to abuse?
That's a great question. I think the primary and number one reason why abuse happens in schools is that they have a built in power dynamic. It is something that is reinforced in every day. It's part of lots of conversations about education. I remember when I was a kid being told to listen to my teachers, obey what they said, do whatever they told me. I have to be respectful and honor them. I have to listen to what my teachers say. I remember many days going off to school and that being the goodbye thing. I love you. Go have a wonderful day. Go listen to your teachers. Schools have significant power differentials, and that is something that's reinforced by almost everybody involved, from the parents to administrators to staff to teachers, and children themselves say, hey, you should listen to the teacher, you should respect them. When we talk about abuse, it's easy to be focused on sexual abuse, but you just think about how many people do you know who have had horrible examples of emotional abuse that was originating from teachers.
Josh, I'm guilty. I know I am the parent that would often say, do what your teachers tell you to do. I know I often ask teachers, were they well behaved? Are they obedient? I think I learned my lesson after about the third child that came home one day and told me that her teacher had said, what happens in this classroom stays in this classroom, and actually told a kid to climb up on the top of the school onto the roof and jump and end his life. And my daughter challenged the teacher. And I think that was the first time I said, good for you. It's what happens in a classroom should not stay in the classroom. Teachers need to be held responsible. I can remember in high school seeing a teacher literally take a kid and hitting his head up against the blackboard and telling him to be on his tiptoes for an hour with his nose in a small circle that he had drawn on the blackboard, and literally just smashing the kid's head up on the blackboard. I mean, I'm showing my age here, but I remember being strapped in kindergarten, and I think that all kids can remember times when their teachers crossed the line. And I think this is probably the second reason why I think abuse is really prevalent in schools. And that is because kids are alone in a classroom, the isolation with that teacher. And that teacher is with them all day long. And often, after many, many years, 40 years of being in a classroom with students, teachers grow weary, they grow tired, they get very little break. Their impatience wears thin, and no one is holding them accountable because they are in a classroom alone with students. Would you agree, Josh?
Absolutely. I mean, I've had experience both in the United States, Canada, and now in the UK of being in classrooms, and the variety of the amount of support and accountability that exists ranges massively. Here in the UK and in much of Europe, Having multiple adults in the classroom is the norm. Having a classroom that only has a teacher in it, it's kind of a shocking thing here. It's very, very out of the norm, and teachers would have huge problems with it. Whereas I know in Canada and America, because of underfunding, overstuffed classrooms, all the other issues that come up, it's the norm to only have one adult in a classroom. I remember both in teacher education and as a professional being left in a classroom with 60 odd students alone. I also remember it being a norm for teachers to do one-on-one intervention with students alone in a classroom during lunch breaks or during recess. Having a kid stay back after school is a good way to get one-on-one interaction with them and be able to really help them with maybe their math sums or something like that. That's not only the norm, it's also advised practice to say, if you've got a kid who's struggling, it's admirable to pull them aside and spend some one-on-one time with them and help them with whatever the subject is. It's absolutely crazy that that is the norm in education and has been for ages, just increasing that isolation, decreasing accountability, times where there's almost no adults in the whole building and there could be an adult alone in a classroom with a child or with a teenager. Such a dangerous situation to put yourself into.
That speaks to the whole issue of schools are also a place of trust, similar to churches, and often many of the locations that we work with, parents trust teachers. Parents trust that what is happening in the school is appropriate. And often we don't ask questions. We don't ask those tough questions of educators and administration. And we just trust that the person that is in the classroom has been screened, has been vetted, that they have a good reputation, that they have no disciplinary steps on their file. But I found that actually, when you go look at some of the disciplinary action of teachers that have either lost their license, sometimes that is only for a period of 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and then they're instilled back into the classroom. And I don't think that often parents ask that question. Has there ever been a disciplinary step against this teacher?
One of the challenges that we have here is the fact that most school boards in North America have unions in place, which can add some real complexity to the political and social dynamic that we're talking about here. As an example, many boards and districts have in place rules that actually schools aren't allowed to proffer that information. Some governing agencies and districts have things where most of those records are hidden away for the sake of the teacher, for the security of the teacher's role and position. Ultimately, whatever you think about unions, there's a political and social dynamic that does come up when there are teachers' unions in place. It makes reporting and even sometimes recording incidences or allegations or suspicions problematic.
I really appreciate the Ontario College of Teachers. They have a magazine that they publish, I believe quarterly or something, and there are blue pages in that magazine, and it is all the disciplinary steps against a teacher. And you can go online and you can even look up, have there been any disciplinary action steps against that teacher? And it is public knowledge, and I actually appreciate that.
It's really good. It's really, really good. It is a challenge as a teacher because there is an adversarial dynamic. Sometimes you can feel like it's the teachers versus the administrators, or it's the teachers versus the board. It can feel like it's the teachers versus the union, or what other political dynamics are happening, which makes you want to band together. And instead of reporting or recording allegations or suspicions, instead of addressing issues that you're seeing coming up, it's a lot easier to kind of stick together and want to back each other up. It's not dissimilar to things you have like the thin blue line with police officers, where there's a code of silence or a code of conduct, which means you're disloyal if you do report suspicions or allegations, or you record anything on paper and submit it in. It can be a real challenge for just accountability. It's a huge challenge to being able to get clear information out there and protect the children and youth that are in our care.
I think it's so important to have policy in place that states need to know, that whole need to know, who needs to know if there's been an allegation or suspicion of abuse, why it's so important to suspend someone until an investigation has been completed. And if anyone has any history of child abuse, crimes against a child or a young person, that there are long-term consequences, not only that they lose their license for a period of time or they serve time in jail and do their time on behalf of society, but those students have to live with that incident of abuse the rest of their lives. So there should be long-term consequences to any form of abuse. I think that the whole lack of funding, Josh, can you speak to that at all? I know that often funding also is an issue when it comes to child protection.
Last week, I remember you saying that you've never been to a church that wasn't looking for more volunteers. I've never worked at a school, been to a school, been anywhere near a school that didn't need more funding. It is so common for our schools and boards to be underfunded, to be struggling with not enough teachers, not enough classrooms, not enough space. Funding is a significant aspect of this. When we lose funding, we lose the extra personnel, the hall monitors, we lose the guidance counselors, those who are supposed to be the safe people to make reports to, and things like that. With lower funding, we've got larger classroom sizes, and that can be a huge challenge because all of a sudden there's more kids in a classroom to an adult, putting more stressors and challenges in front of them. One of the big things with funding is also that there are structural limitations oftentimes in schools, is that they're not able to update their buildings to have better sightlines. We've worked with a lot of small private schools with Plan to Protect, and oftentimes they'll have really interesting and unique building layouts with isolated classrooms, small little storage closets that they've converted into one-on-one session areas in a very remote part of the building. And these challenges that they have because of underfunding have only increased the danger. They've increased the isolation, and they've made it so that accountability, visibility are all decreased, increasing the vulnerability of abuse.
I think also the fact that when there is a lack of funding, then we see the increase in the number of students in the classroom that have special needs. And we know that students with special needs are much more likely to be abused than a child that does not have special needs. And so that puts greater pressure also on the teacher. Another reason I think is I know that when we went on class trips, we would often be asked to be a chaperone on a class trip. And the whole time my children were in school, I was never asked to be screened or trained in child protection. I would have all day long with a group of students and often on my own, either at a amusement park or an outdoor park or at a museum. And even overnight trips I would go on as a chaperone. No one asked me to provide references, any form of screening. And now I think that we send less parent chaperones on trips, but that really throws off ratios when you think that an off-site trip, a class trip, requires adjusted ratios because of the elevated risk. I think that often school trips are not meeting those ratios at all. Josh, any other ideas on why you think schools are prone to abuse?
Yeah, I think the last big one that I had on my list, which was just the assumption of expertise, the reliance on professionalism, and just this idea that the teacher knows best. This is somebody who's studied and trained to be a teacher. But that generally means that they've studied pedagogy, they've studied how to teach, they might have studied their subject matter. That doesn't mean they've spent a lot of time really understanding how to care for children, how to take care of them, or anything related to accountability, to safety and protection from abuse. Recognizing indicators should be one of the primary things that they teach around safety in teacher education, but it almost never comes up. This goes back to one of our first points about just parents saying, go listen to your teachers. They know what they're talking about. Parents can often think, I don't know anything about kids, but the teacher, they're an expert in this field. They know everything about kids, and so there can be an over-reliance that builds into trust, which decreases ratios, underfunding. All of this becomes one giant package that kind of ties in together, creating a vulnerable environment in education.
I do want to say that, again, that we believe that most teachers are excellent. Certainly with my own children, they had way more excellent teachers than they had poor teachers. And I know that is even my own experience when I was in school. Teachers have such a tremendous opportunity when it comes to abuse prevention. They are often the ones that students will disclose abuse to, familial abuse, abuse that's happening within the home. It is the students that will tell their teachers. It will be the teachers that recognize indicators of abuse. Most reports of abuse are made by teachers, and I am just so grateful for that. And I think that because teachers now know they have a mandated duty to report abuse, they are following their gut reactions and their discernment, and they are making those calls when it comes to abuse that happens outside of the school. I believe parents need to hold schools, school boards much more accountable to the opportunity to abuse students within the school. I think that it takes a village to raise a child. And I think that requires us holding teachers and schools accountable, and teachers also calling child and family services, calling child protection agencies if they believe a child is in need of protection. I believe schools need a whistleblower policy where they will be able to and be willing to blow the whistle if they feel that a child is in need of protection from another teacher. One of the best books I can recommend in regard to educator abuse is Invisible Target by our friend Andrea Clement. Andrea has written an excellent book on child abuse and abuse within schools and the education system. From her own story of being abused by her middle school teacher, Andrea writes a book that is just chock full of statistics, challenging questions, lessons for parents, students, the community, teachers, and administration. I really recommend Andrea's book, Invisible Target, to you. Anything in closing, Josh?
Yeah, I just want to echo what you were saying about how excellent teachers are. It's a beautiful and valuable calling, and to spend your life educating and loving on the kids that are in your care. It's a wonderful thing, and I value and I treasure those years that I spent in education as a teacher in primary schools. I also know that it is a dangerous and challenging thing to do. And so we just commend you if you are in education, private school, public school, high school, elementary, or nursery. We commend you and we thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for making the world a safer place. Please pass this podcast along to those who you know who are in education. It's always good to have a reminder about protecting the vulnerable in our care.
And know that we are always available. We provide services for churches, schools, camps, daycares, sporting leagues, nursing homes. Because abuse happens within all segments of society, at Plan to Protect, we are here to help you shore up your policies, provide training that's specific to your sector. Josh, close us off.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast this week, Melody. It's nice to be in the main segment, not just in the intro. Thank you so much for joining us for Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. Please like, subscribe, and share the podcast with your friends and family, those especially in education today. We hope you have a wonderful day. Bye now.
See you next week. Bye.